A federal judge. A member of Congress. A system built to uphold justice, now shielding one of the most dangerous bioweapon leaks ever recorded. And only one woman dares to say, no. When Pam Bondi receives a series of anonymous reports, she has no idea she's stepping into the heart of a national conspiracy. Pages of documents redacted. Witnesses disappearing. Orders cloaked in language that sounds perfectly legal. She has no army. No official power. But she holds the one thing the entire system fears most, the truth. The afternoon light filtered through the glass windows of Pam Bondi's office, casting faint beams across a desk cluttered with papers. These weren't ordinary case files. Pam was staring at confidential reports sent from an anonymous source, documents detailing biological research at a national facility conducting experiments tied to bioweapons. She sat motionless. Her eyes scanning every detail on the pages, while a storm of thoughts began to form in her mind. The descriptions of biological experiments, and the leak of bioweapon samples, left her shaken. This wasn't just a minor scandal. It had the potential to become a national catastrophe. Throughout her career, Pam had faced dangerous and complex cases. But this was the first time she felt that what lay before her might not only reshape her future, but threaten the entire system. Taking a deep breath, she reached for her landline and tapped in the number of her investigation team. Her voice was calm, but razor-sharp. Get me a full report on these facilities. Immediately. We are not letting this get buried. If any of this is true, we're looking at a full-blown crisis. She hung up, her chest tight with resolve, and a rising unease. Pam had battled formidable enemies before. But this was different. The system didn't want her digging too deep. And she knew, the moment she stepped into this, there would be no turning back. Turning back to the documents on her desk, she whispered to herself. Justice is justice. And I will do whatever it takes to defend it, even if it costs me everything. She had chosen this path. And nothing would stop her now. But deep down, she knew, this might be the fiercest battle of her life. Just as Pam made the decision to pursue the investigation, a series of encrypted messages arrived from a covert source inside the research agency, blowing the case wide open. Several bioweapon samples had been removed and transferred off-site without any official record, and the efforts to cover it up extended beyond rogue staff. People in real power were involved, including Judge Jonathan Hayes. At that same moment, Pam realized this was no ordinary corruption case. This could be one of the most severe threats she had ever encountered, one that might endanger national security itself. But her enemies weren't just corrupt officials. They were the protectors of the corruption, and even Judge Hayes, who had issued rulings shielding those involved, had become complicit in concealing critical evidence. Pam understood now. She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was up against a political machine, and the legal system itself was turning against her. A soft beep echoed from Pam Bondi's laptop as the decryption process completed. She frowned and opened the encrypted file, decoded using an intelligence-grade analysis tool installed specifically for this case by a trusted tech operative on her internal investigation team. The message was sent from an anonymous address using the Tor protocol, but the encryption method was fully compatible with the Department of Energy's internal systems, confirming one thing. The source was inside the government. Pam read slowly, line by line. Internal report hashtag 731-9. Biological sample D17, marked in orange, was moved out of Omega facility on March 4 at 2:43 a.m. No official shipping manifest. Clearance signed by Lieutenant Colonel Art Ellis. Transit approved under Emergency Order 4H-JH. No inspection record left. Surveillance footage from Level 3 exists, deleted from internal system, but cached on backup terminal, Room 12. Without hesitation, Pam forwarded the message to her cybersecurity investigator. Extract that cache from Terminal 12. I want every system log backup from March 3 to 5, focus on anomalous access authorizations. 1 hour later, the system logs came in. A legal tier account had been granted special access at 2:15 a.m. on March 4. Requester, Judge Jonathan Hayes. The name Hayes spread across her screen like a blot of ink dropped in a glass of pure water. Pam said nothing. Instead, she turned to the federal court database. Inside the internal records, she found a special investigation postponement order filed by Hayes at 2:20 p.m. that same day, citing, to prevent interference with ongoing international counterintelligence operations. But something was off, the order hadn't been officially submitted. It sat under drafts, signed, but never sent to the Judicial Department. A faint scent of conspiracy clung to every line. She called her legal advisor. I need every ruling tied to Omega from Hayes over the last 3 months. Look for anything signed but not issued. Especially orders related to transport, inspection, or investigation restrictions. 3 hours later, Pam sat before a thick stack of files. Inside, she found a copy of an internal memo marked "Not for Distribution." It listed agencies that were denied access to the Omega facility, including the FBI, CDC, and even the Department of Justice. The reason was short, per directive from highest legal authority. The final line read: Directive authorized, J. Hayes, ID 1182-7, Fed. Pam clenched her fists. She had seen enough to understand what was unfolding. A bioweapon leak. A facility under false lockdown. An investigation hold used as a smokescreen. And a judge not just abusing power, but actively enabling the cover-up. Just then, the door to her office flew open. Her investigator, Alvarez, entered with a grave look. Boss. We found unauthorized access to an internal server during the log analysis. The IP trace matches the office of Congressman Tom Harris. He may be monitoring the case. Pam sat in silence for a few seconds. Tom Harris, Senior Strategic Advisor. Known for backing bioweapon security legislation, and the man who had publicly attacked her during last year's hearings. She exhaled slowly, her eyes stealing over. Then it's time we speak face to face. She grabbed her coat and headed out. But before closing the door, she looked back at the file stack, where Hayes' signature lay like an unerasable stain. I won't let you bury this, she murmured, her voice nearly a declaration of war. The underground meeting room had no windows, no recording devices. Only a dim overhead light, bright enough to see each other, yet shadowed enough to make every word feel like a secret. Pam Bondi stepped inside with sharp, decisive steps, her eyes sweeping across every corner of the room like a soldier surveying the battlefield. Across from her, Senator Tom Harris lounged back in his chair, gaze calm, as if this meeting were just another dull formality in a week full of political rituals. Harris slowly swirled the whiskey in his glass. The amber light reflecting off the dark wooden table in quiet arcs. Pam stopped by the table, choosing not to sit. Her voice was soft but firm. I came so you wouldn't say I never gave you a chance to explain. Harris tilted his head slightly, eyes still fixed on the glass. A faint, tired, almost mocking, smile flickered on his lips. Pam, you should have come to listen. Not to accuse. Slowly, Pam took the seat across from him, her hands clasped on the table. Her voice remained steady, though anger clenched in her chest. Surveillance footage erased. Server data tampered with. I have timestamps, access logs, your name. And I've got a team digging deeper by the minute. Harris finally looked up. A flash of sharpness in his eyes, quickly masked behind his usual smirk. You're playing a hand with no aces. You've got fragments. I've got the system. Pam went quiet. She didn't look at him, her gaze dropped to the table, as if she were weighing something far heavier than facts. When she looked up again, her eyes had changed, no longer burning with anger, but cold and clear. I don't need the system. I just need one crack for the light to get in. Harris chuckled softly, a slow, deliberate sound, like mourning someone already lost. And what happens when that light burns you alive? Pam tilted her head slightly, her voice soft, almost a whisper. If I have to burn to expose the truth, at least I won't have bowed to lies. The air thickened. Harris set his glass aside and, for the first time, leaned forward, his gaze dark, heavy like midwinter fog. Pam, if you keep going, you won't just be facing Hayes. You'll be staring down people whose names never appear in any report, and they like to keep it that way. Pam didn't blink. Her voice dropped, sharp and slicing through the silence. I know. And because no one's ever named them. I will. A long silence fell. Harris watched her for a while, then slowly rose to his feet. You remind me of myself, Pam. Back when I believed a file folder could change the world. Pam stood too. She said nothing, just looked at him. No hatred. No pity. Only the gaze of someone who had chosen a road with no return. Harris turned, took a few steps, then paused, his voice low, echoing behind him. Don't say I didn't warn you. Pam nodded, without looking back. I won't. Outside the meeting room. A message pinged. Alvarez had sent a decrypted fragment. Recovered internal chats from Omega server. Names, Harris, Hayes, and a secret meeting scheduled 18 hours post-leak. Decryption in progress. Pam gripped the phone slightly tighter, eyes fixed on the screen. In that moment, she knew. The real battle was just beginning. The glow of the computer screen cast sharp lines across Pam Bondi's tense face in the silent night. The quiet hum of the laptop's cooling fan echoed through the still room, in that silence. Even the smallest sounds felt like pressure. Pam sat frozen, hands poised on the keyboard, eyes locked onto the screen as the data recovery software reached its final line. Recovery complete, 7 deleted files found. Her heart clenched. She had retrieved the data from an SSD salvaged during a brief breach into the Omega facility's tech office, a drive that was supposed to be permanently wiped. But thanks to Alvarez's insertion of a low-level boot code, the forensic software had unearthed the last surviving fragments of logs. She slipped on her headphones and clicked on the first file, an 11-second audio clip, riddled with static, but clear enough to catch a single phrase, repeated twice. Transmission suspended, verification code, JH1182. Pam pulled off the headphones, her grip tightening on the armrest. Verification code. Judicial haze. No doubt remained. A soft knock. Alvarez entered, eyes sunken from 3 sleepless nights, holding a tablet and a thick stack of documents. His voice was quick, broken by a short breath. I found a deleted conversation, internal network. Not encrypted. The sender used an admin-level account, but the recipient's name was scrubbed. He placed the tablet on her desk. Pointing to the final line. They don't want the press to find out. Someone's handling this internally. If anything happens to me, send this to the prosecutor. Pam read it 3 times. Her throat dried. It felt like a final confession. She exhaled heavily, rose, pulled out her phone, enabled triple-layer encryption, and called the head of her digital surveillance unit. Her voice was flat. Cold. Push this file to Team P2's internal server. Mirror it. If anything tampers with the system, I want evidence in place before it disappears. The next morning. The cold white lights of the internal operations room flooded the space. On the whiteboard, a web of names and connections, officials, judges, research staff. Screenshots. Text messages, GPS data pinned across the wall, like a spiderweb drawn in black ink and dried blood. Pam entered, holding a printed transcript of the recovered statement. She placed it on the table. No words, only a nod to Alvarez. He understood and stepped forward to activate the projector. On the big screen, a short audio clip played. A woman's voice, trembling, but clear. They know I've been watching. I heard a call between someone at the DOJ and the court. No names, just JH, and Harris needs to keep it quiet. I don't know how much time I have. The room fell silent. Standing beneath the halo of the projector light, Pam crossed her arms, eyes cold as steel. Her voice echoed through the stillness. This isn't a technical breach. This is betrayal. And the worst part is, it's being legalized, one step at a time. A young staffer, face pale, voice shaking, broke the silence. Are we really going to take this to court? Pam turned toward him, calm and resolute. She stepped closer, nodding firmly, voice unwavering. Yes. Because if we don't, tomorrow. It'll be my name on the internal resolution list. She turned to the board, pulled a red marker, and slashed a bold line through. Dr. Celia Voss disappeared after warning issued. Without taking her eyes off the board, Pam spoke loud and clear. She was a living witness. And if she's still alive, I will bring her to light. If not, then I'll speak the truth for her. At that moment, Alvarez slid a new file across the table. A search denial order, signed 12 hours after the internal email deletion, bearing the unmistakable signature of Judge Hayes. Pam's eyes locked on the bottom of the page. Quietly, she closed the folder. Her voice was low, burdened but unflinching. He's not going to let us near Omega. Alvarez looked up, swallowed hard. So what now? Still standing, hand on the file, Pam answered, slowly, but with fire in her tone. Now I face him. Publicly. In front of the court. And in front of every single person who thought I'd stay silent like all the victims before me. That morning, the federal courtroom was no longer a place of judgment. It had become a stage, and the 2 lead actors, Pam Bondi and Judge Jonathan Hayes, weren't merely clashing with arguments. But with power, history, and the very fear they once instilled in others. Every press seat was filled. Live streams were rolling. Justice Department officials were present, silent, calculating. Pam stood at the center of the room, clad in a charcoal gray tailored suit, her gaze as calm and precise as a honed blade. In her hand, a folder stamped in red, confidential, Omega leak. Her voice rang out, cutting through the thick air. I submit the system log from March 4th, the date biological sample D-17 was removed from Omega. The log records a legal tier access authorization at exactly 2:17 a.m. The verified address directly links to an account marked JH1182. From the high bench, Hayes furrowed his brow. Leaning forward slightly. His voice dropped, cold as steel. You're accusing a federal judge of abuse of power, based on a line of code? Pam didn't blink. She nodded slightly. Her voice razor-sharp. I'm not accusing. I'm facing the truth. And I believe this court exists to do the same. Hayes let out a soft, bitter laugh. Turning to glance at the prosecutor beside him, a silent appeal to an old ally. Ms. Bondi, he said, lips curling in what looked like a smile but lacked all warmth, this is a hearing. Not a political rally. You are not permitted to turn it into a personal crusade. Pam took one step forward, her eyes flashing with steel. I don't need slogans. I have evidence. And if that makes you uncomfortable, I'm afraid truth rarely comes dressed to please. A low murmur spread through the gallery. Cameras clicked rapidly. Flashbulbs ignited. Hayes' voice tightened. His fingers clenched his pen until it nearly snapped. You're exceeding your authority. I could have you removed for contempt of court. Pam raised her chin, her grip firm on the folder. Her voice struck the chamber like a bell marking the hour. And you can do that, right after I submit this internal chat log between tech personnel and someone referred to as Mr. J. Including verification codes and the exact time you intervened in the security system. Hayes rose. For the first time. His black robe fluttered slightly. And the air in the room shifted like a storm front rolling in. He closed his eyes briefly, choosing his words with surgical precision. When he opened them, his gaze was ice. Request for search warrant of Omega facility, he said, clipping each word, is denied. The room froze. Pam's hand clenched around the folder. Her voice cracked through the silence. Official reason? Hayes lowered his tone, tapping his pen rhythmically on the bench, each tap like the ticking of a clock counting down to an execution. Submitted materials lacked direct evidence linking the leaked sample to individuals within the judiciary. A search could disrupt current national defense collaborations active at the facility. Pam's brow furrowed. She took another step forward, her tone sharp but controlled. What national defense program requires deletion of access logs? Internal investigation blocks. And a researcher gone missing without explanation for over a week. Hayes didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, it was like reciting a familiar script. The court is under no obligation to disclose matters of national security to a lone prosecutor, not even you. Pam stepped up to the bench, her voice rising, no longer restrained. You're shielding those who've betrayed justice. And I will not stop until the full truth is laid bare. Before the people. Before the law. And before every person who thought themselves untouchable. Silence. Not even breath moved. Reporters leapt from their seats. Flash after flash exploded across the chamber. A few Justice Department members lowered their heads. Hayes didn't reply. He sat upright, hands gripping the arms of his chair like stone. Pam stepped back. She held the folder close as she turned, walking to the center of the courtroom like she just detonated a bomb in the system's heart. And she knew. The tremors from today wouldn't stop at the courthouse. After the fiery hearing with Hayes, Pam Bondi was no longer just a prosecutor in the eyes of the system. She had become the embodiment of what those in power feared most. A woman who knew too much, and refused to stay silent. Prosecutor or political provocateur? The Omega case, does she really have the evidence? Judge Hayes, insulted, in court, DOJ remained silent. Then came the night. The first message arrived at 2:13 a.m. No sender. No subject. No punctuation. If you keep going the next to disappear won't be the scientist. No signature. No second line. Pam set the phone down. She didn't reply. Didn't call Alvarez. Didn't save the message. She simply locked the screen. And didn't sleep in the office, as she usually did. She understood. The war was no longer inside the courtroom. It had entered the unseen realm, where laws don't protect anyone. The next morning, walking into the Department of Justice, Pam felt a chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning. She passed down the third-floor hallway, once familiar, almost familial. But now, footsteps around her slowed. Some colleagues turned away. Others pretended not to see her. Outside her office, the printer was running, spitting out copies of anonymous complaints. Bondi has overstepped authority. Disrupted internal order. Potential leak of classified data to media. She didn't pick them up. Just stared at them. Expressionless face. But eyes, cold and still, like water in a deep well. 4:46 p.m. Her private office. The door burst open. Alvarez stepped in, breath tight, face pale with panic. In his hands, a blurred set of printed files, and a USB drive taped with medical gauze. He set them down and lowered his voice. We've been breached. Internal access logs leaked to DarkFed. System verification codes included. Some pages are already spreading under the hashtag #OmegaLeak. Pam clenched the armrest. Her brow furrowed. Her voice was low, firm. Who released it? Alvarez shook his head, slow and defeated. Can't trace it. But the worst part, the leak's been doctored. They cut parts of your conversations with the tech team. It looks like you were coercing them to lie. Pam said nothing. She leaned forward and opened the file, red marks everywhere. The misleading sections carefully circled. One transcribed audio clip started with, Ms. Bondi said, if we have enough, we can bring them to court. No context. No follow-up line, if we get lawful confirmation. Pam leaned back in her chair. Eyes on the ceiling. A long breath. Very long. 8:34 p.m. The office empty. Rain tapping gently against the windows outside. She sat alone, desk lamp casting shadows across her thinning face. Her chin tilted slightly, as if in silent conversation with herself. On the table, her phone displayed a string of anonymous texts. You're gambling with more than your career. We know where you live. Image attached, her mother's house, taken from across the street, at night. Pam stared at the screen. No screaming. No breaking down. Just rain. And the ticking of the clock, like distant knocks at the door. 11:01 p.m. She opened a drawer and pulled out a file stamped. Urgent, internal use only. Flipping through pages, witnesses no longer reachable. Dr. Celia Voss, missing. Isaac, lead technician, absent 4 days, phone off, apartment cameras disabled. She paused on a handwritten note, her own. If something happens, who will be brave enough to speak next? Her hand froze. She put the pen down. And for the first time in years, Pam rested her head on her arm. Not to cry, but to hear if she was still breathing. After a few minutes, she rose. Walked to the window. Looked out at the city lights. In her hand, a new photograph. Placed quietly on her desk just hours ago. A picture of herself, inside her apartment. Taken through a long lens. At night. Glass door half closed. No one noticed. Still staring at the image, Pam whispered, voice low, neither angry nor afraid, only anchored in truth. They want me to stop. But I wasn't born to turn back. After the personal attacks, late-night threats, and increasing isolation within the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi entered a new phase, not of resistance, but quiet reconstruction. Internal meetings stopped. Emails sent through official channels were often bounced back or met with silence. But she never stopped working. No need for internal networks. No need for upper-level approvals. She retreated into her own spaces, an old desk, portable hard drives, and printouts long buried in the archives. One night, in a makeshift data consolidation room, Alvarez quietly restored a ghosted image of the Omega facility's server firmware. The forensic software he used didn't scan regular data, it searched for annotations buried deep within the system's hidden layers, often overlooked. I found a system-level comment, Alvarez said. His voice low. Not a main file. Just a technical instruction. But it might be the missing piece. Pam stepped closer. The blue light from the screen cast cold tension across her face. It logs a meeting between JH and TH, Alvarez continued, where they instructed the deactivation of all tracking systems related to sample D-17. There's even a note, no time logs to be retained. Pam said nothing. She already knew, JH was Jonathan Hayes. And TH could only be Tom Harris. We don't have audio. No signatures. But if they deliberately disabled the entire trace system, then that act alone is a signal. Her voice was quiet, as if weaving threads in her mind. They thought they wiped everything. But they didn't realize metadata, those system notes, live on a level they don't control. She turned, eyes locking onto the large board on the wall, a spiderweb of faces, names. Red strings connecting shadowy lines of power. In that moment, Pam Bondi was no longer a prosecutor on the defense. She was the one taking control. She whispered. We don't need a trap. We just need light. From that moment, her campaign was no longer defensive. It was a counterattack. Pam reorganized her team. Alvarez continued tracing system anomalies. Jenny, one of the last trusted staff, was dispatched to the old equipment vault to locate unmodified firmware backups. And Pam herself, she took on the painstaking task of reviewing every technical report from the last 18 months. Late one night, when the final forensic tool decrypted a stream of data from the third hard drive, Pam found it. A directive sent from Hayes through a high-level secure account. Not complete. No signature. But the tone, sentence structure, and choice of language, identical to his written rulings. And that was enough. No confession was needed. Just connection. A chain that exposed it all. The secret meetings, the orders to halt investigations, and the invisible commands that made both people and evidence disappear. Pam stood before the board. Holding the photograph taken through her apartment window, the one that had nearly broken her. Now, she looked at it, without fear, without hesitation. They cleared the battlefield. She said calmly, but they forgot one footprint. And in that moment, she knew. It was time to bring everything into the light. Morning. The office lights were still off when Pam sat alone in the small basement meeting room. On the table lay a dossier over 300 pages thick, recovered data painstakingly restored by Alvarez and Jenny after nearly 2 weeks of non-stop work. She flipped through page after page. The evidence was no longer fragmented. Now, it formed a system, tightly interlocked. Audio recording of Hayes ordering the deletion of system access logs. Internal notes recovered from an old firmware device. Meta-logs referencing the JH-TH meeting to disable trace controls. Deleted email titled D-17 update, no public response. Celia Voss's vanished report, extracted from a personal machine backup. Alvarez stood in the corner, silent. Jenny clutched a lukewarm cup of coffee. No one spoke. No one needed to. Pam raised her head, eyes unblinking as they scanned every final detail. They left no signatures, she said, voice cold and steady. But their desperate attempt to erase everything became the strongest proof. She closed the file, stood up, and spoke with the clarity of command. Get ready. We're bringing this into the light, today. The press conference. 3 p.m., Department of Justice Headquarters, ground floor briefing room. Reporters packed the space. Live feeds were rolling from 4 major networks. The atmosphere was thick, like the air before a storm. No one knew exactly what Pam Bondi was about to announce. But the entire city was waiting. Pam stepped up to the podium. Dark navy suit. No notes. No script. She looked directly into the row of cameras, as if staring into the eyes of a nation. Her voice rang out, not loud, but magnetic. For months, our investigation has followed a trail of scattered pieces, deleted files, destroyed devices, vanished witnesses, intimidated staff. And the silence of those who once swore to uphold the law. We've recovered internal directives issued from high-level government accounts, instructing a total shutdown of trace logs at the Omega facility. We have an audio recording of Judge Jonathan Hayes personally ordering log deletion and obstruction of the investigation. We have evidence that Tom Harris, currently a sitting member of the National Security Committee, participated in meetings designed to cover up the D-17 bioweapons leak. And most importantly, we have the truth. She paused, letting those final words echo before delivering the blow. Pam looked to the front row. Her voice sharpened like a blade. We cannot live in the dark any longer. Those who conceal the truth will be held accountable, in public, under the law, and before the very victims they once reduced to numbers. The room was silent. No camera wobbled. No whispers. Just the endless rhythm of camera shutters. Firing like a countdown. The next morning, the Department of Justice issued an emergency mandate. A rare public federal trial. One of the few in U.S. history, where a sitting high-ranking judge would face charges of abuse of power, investigation tampering, and complicity in a bioweapons leak. Pam knew this would be the final act. Either she would fall, or the system would finally be forced to face itself. Federal Court, Courtroom 7A. This was a trial unlike any in the history of the American justice system, not just because the accused was a judge, but because the prosecutor standing across from him was once part of the very system now on trial. Jonathan Hayes, former federal judge. Tom Harris, sitting congressman. 3 mid-level officials from the Department of Justice, all complicit in slowing the investigation. And Pam Bondi, no longer just a prosecutor, but the woman dragging the system itself into the light. The presiding judge struck the gavel. This court convenes today to hear the case against the defendants for abuse of power, manipulation of the justice system, concealment of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses related to the D-17 bioweapon leak at Omega facility. Pam stepped to the stand. Her voice was sharp, cold, and steady. No need to raise it. I won't retell everything. I will show how those seated here used their power to dismantle the very system they swore to protect. Exhibit 1 was introduced. A recovered system command log, the deletion of all traces of D-17. Pam, eyes on the projection screen, stated. This command, _all_logs D-17 override, originated from a fixed IP assigned to Hayes' office. Executed at 2:11 a.m., 3 minutes after he left an emergency meeting. Hayes' attorney stood abruptly. Speculation. No one can confirm my client issued that command personally. Pam turned calmly. Then here, a recovered audio file from technician Isaac's personal device. She played the clip. Wipe D-17 logs. I'm not dealing with another Voss situation. The name Celia Voss sent a chill through the courtroom. Witness, Jenny. I personally saw the backup system disabled. Login recorded, Hayes, Fed. Shortly after, I was reassigned without notice. Pam asked. Did you keep anything? Jenny held up her phone. Screenshot. Server code. Timestamp. Exhibit 7 entered into evidence. Harris's attorney interjected. My client only coordinated policy. He never issued commands directly. Pam let out a faint, cutting smile. Her eyes sharpened. This is metadata from an older firmware file, it explicitly states. Approved by TH, no timestamp retention. TH stands for Tom Harris. And he can't deny it when this photo. She held up the image, Harris shaking hands with Hayes in the Capitol garage, holding an Omega encrypted dossier. That same day, all D-17 logs vanished. Witness, Alvarez. I restored metadata from a ghost image. The command read, do not let Bondi see D-17 logs. THJH private meeting confirmed. Immutable system snapshot, cannot be altered. Hayes' lawyer jumped in. The technician could have restored it incorrectly. Pam cut in, voice firm. Then explain why Isaac disappeared the next day. Why Voss went off the grid. And why my emails were blocked, by these 3 officials under Hayes' chain of command. The bench asked. Do you have proof of DOJ interference? Pam nodded. These are 3 separate transfer delay orders, signed by each of the 3 officials. And these, anonymous threats traced back to the DOJ's internal network. One of the officials' hands began to shake. The courtroom seemed to fracture with each breath. Pam stood tall in the center of the room. A beam of light cut through the silence, illuminating her alone, like a lone figure in a cathedral. No one is too powerful to face justice. No system is too sealed to leave no cracks. We traced every data trail. Every threat. Every footprint they tried to bury. I call for the conviction of all defendants for gross misconduct. Threats to national security, and betrayal of public trust. The presiding judge rose. The room cracked open with the sound of the gavel. This court finds Jonathan Hayes, guilty. Tom Harris, guilty. 3 DOJ officials, guilty. All positions and privileges revoked. Referred for federal criminal prosecution. Pam Bondi did not bow. She did not smile. She stood tall, and silent, before a system that, for once, had no choice but to admit. This time, it could not save itself. Days after the trial, the official sentencing was delivered at the federal justice headquarters. Reporters packed the halls. Cameras lined the grand corridor. But no one spoke loudly. No one laughed. For the first time, the system was sentencing its own defenders. The verdict was read aloud. The spokesperson's voice echoed through the courtroom, each word sharp as a hammer hitting concrete. Jonathan Hayes, guilty of abuse of power, deliberate obstruction of a federal investigation, witness intimidation, and tampering with evidence. Sentenced to 20 years in prison without parole. Permanent revocation of all judicial privileges. Tom Harris, guilty of conspiracy, concealment of classified information affecting national security, and unlawful interference with the legal process. Sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Stripped of congressional status and permanently barred from holding public office. 3 DOJ officials, guilty of obstruction of justice, providing false information, and aiding the delay of case processing. Sentenced to 7 to 12 years based on level of involvement. Dismissed from the judicial system. All government financial benefits during tenure to be recovered. Immediately after the sentence was announced, federal officers entered the courtroom. They placed handcuffs on each of the convicted. No protests. No screaming. Just the sound of polished shoes against marble floors. And the relentless flashes of cameras. Harris turned back. For the first time, looking at Pam. You haven't changed anything. The system will always find a way to protect itself. Pam replied, her gaze steady, unblinking. I don't need to change the whole system. I just need to break the silence. Today was the first crack. That afternoon. 3rd floor office. No reporters. No flowers. No champagne. Pam stood alone by the window. Outside, the city bustled, unaware that today she had forced an entire system to bow. On her desk still lay the old case file. And the photograph of her mother's house, taken through a window. On a night when Pam thought she might give up. She picked it up. Stared at it for a long time. Was it enough? Will what we did today ever change what comes tomorrow? No answer came. Only the late sunlight cutting sideways through the glass. Casting the shadow of a woman who still stood tall. Still silent. But never once backed down. Justice is not a destination. It's a journey, often unclear, cold, and far from the flash of cameras. It's not for those who seek safety. It's for those who accept loss in order to protect what's right. Even when no one stands behind them. Pam Bondi is not a hero. She's just one person, who knew too much. And refused to stay silent. But from that solitude, she created something the system could never control. A crack, where the light could get in. If you stayed until the very last second of this story, we want to hear from you. Have you ever felt the truth was buried by power? Do you believe that even one person can force a system to change? Leave your comment below. We're listening. If you believe in stories that dare to speak truth, that dare to shine light into the darkest corners, hit subscribe. Like to amplify the message. Share so no one is left in the dark. Because justice doesn't start with the system. It starts with each of us.